Good evening. My name is Marvin Alonzo Greer. I'm the lead historic interpretation and community engagement officer at the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission. And welcome to tonight's program, Echoes of the Enslaved, hosted at Montpelier Historic Site. Tonight we'll be joined by my friend Joe McGill, the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. Joe?
Well, thank you, Marvin. It seems like I get to hang out with you somewhere in these United States. Tonight here in Maryland, I find places like where we're at right now, at Montpelier here. I spend nights at spaces like this because I bring attention to the slave dwellings. You know, even if the slave dwellings don't exist anymore, I still interact with the sites because we want to bring attention to the fact that, yeah, we are appreciative of these nice, beautiful, architecturally significant houses, but there are also slave dwellings that we should be as equally concerned about. So that's my purpose of being here tonight.
Well, thank you, Joe. And tonight you'll be sleeping right here at Montpelier, and we're actually sitting on hallowed ground. The area we're sitting in right now used to be the kitchen for the house, and undoubtedly enslaved individuals not only would have worked in this kitchen, but most likely would have slept here as well. Yeah,
and that's the goal. You know, once upon a time, one could come to a site like this and hear all about what went on in the nice, beautiful house, but very seldom would they hear about the lives of the enslaved. And all that went on in this spot was necessary for all that went on in that house to be carried on. A lot that went on in that house was at the expense of stolen labor. And that's what the Slave Dwelling Project is about, bringing attention to all that.
Awesome. Well, for those of you who are just joining us, you can always tune in on our social media platforms, PG Parks, or PG Parks History on Facebook, as well as pgparks.com. So, so today we're gonna be joined by two moderators that will be off camera. I will start off with Dennis, who will be one of our off-screen moderators.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Dennis Doster, and I'm the Black History Program Manager.
And my name's Stephanie Sperling. I am the Senior Archaeologist. Welcome.
So as you all tune in today and you have questions, you have comments, both Dennis and Stephanie will be fielding those questions, and then either myself or Joe or Stephanie or Dennis will be helping us answer those questions for you. So Joe, can you tell us a little bit about how you started this slave dwelling project and kind of how you came here to be with us here in Maryland?
Yeah, Marvin, as a fellow Civil War reenactor, I used to go to battlefields, and we had the pleasure of doing Civil War reenactments at these historic battlefields. But above and beyond that, we got to sleep at these places also. And sleeping at these places, we got to have conversations, usually with people who don't look like me and you. Because a lot of times these are Confederate reenactors. They reenact for the reasons that they do. And having conversations with them can get real interesting at times. Also, I was an employee at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Of course, their major goal is to save buildings. And usually there are those historically significant buildings. The third thing is, of course, my DNA compels me to honor the enslaved ancestors. So bringing all these three things together is why the Slave Dwelling Project exists right now. Of course, initially, 10 years ago, my intent was just to stay within the state of South Carolina. But now, 10 years later, I'm still at it. And we've gone to 25 states and the District of Columbia, spending nights in slave dwellings.
That's amazing. So I know, as a fellow Southerner as yourself, and some people are surprised that Maryland was complicit in slavery as well as the slave trade. Have you been to other places that people are surprised that enslaved people lived?
Yeah, when I tell people what I do with the Slave Dwelling Project, I get the most pushback from Northerners because, 10 years ago, I thought I kept slavery in a box at plantations in the South. Well, there are a lot of people who still do that, and when I tell Northerners that I've gone to 25 states and the District of Columbia, I let them know that 8 of those states have been Northern states. That's when the pushback comes. Because, to them, their history is all about the Revolution. It's all about the Underground Railroad. It's all about those Northern men who went down south during the Civil War to rid us of this institution of slavery. And the fact that those states themselves, prior to the Revolution, enslaved people also. Sometimes it's a surprise to them. Sometimes it's not a surprise, they just want to ignore it. So I get a lot of pushback there.
So I'm relatively new here to Prince George's County Parks, and one thing that I'm learning coming here to places like Montpelier and other historic sites within our Prairie View is the amount of history and the deep, rich history that our enslaved ancestors left. Men like George, who was enslaved here by the Snowdens on one of his properties, was able to liberate himself and gain their freedom. And as we go through the records of other historic sites within Prince George's County, we have people that were able to liberate themselves by running away. People that who were manumitted by, like Henny, who was enslaved here by the Snowdens. She was manumitted by the family, but also people who were able throughout the county, who were able to petition and use the courts to get their freedom. Have you discovered a rich history in your other travels of African Americans kind of using their own agency as forms of resistance?
Yeah, a lot of what we've been told, a lot of the history that's been disseminated to us, gives us that impression of the happy slave. That was not always the case. We were doing those things. Well, very seldom was that the case. We were doing those things to obtain our freedom. Something as simple as sabotage, breaking a tool or burning down a storehouse or something of that nature. But freeing ourselves, running to freedom. A lot of people are surprised that it was kind of a regional thing. The Underground Railroad ran more than north. You're in Maryland right here, of course. The logical thing, if you had the knowledge, was to go north. But if you were in South Carolina, where I live, the logical thing was to go south because of what the Spanish were doing to disrupt the English colonization. Of course, the Spanish were just as much colonizers as the English were. But controlling Florida at the time, they got the word out to the enslaved people in Georgia and South Carolina that if they made it to Florida, they would be free, which was indeed the case. And that was the Stoner Rebellion in 1739, was that attempt for enslaved people to make it south. Now, the further west you went, of course, the further west you needed to keep going to seek that freedom that you were seeking. And sometimes it's something as simple as leaving the place that you're oppressed. Sometimes it's going into those swamps and the places that people dare not follow and start maroon communities.
Oh, so I know what a maroon community is, but for those people who are tuning in who've never heard of a maroon community, what is a maroon community?
Yeah, it's those places. If you take a place like Jamaica, if you were to escape and go into those mountains, you're now maroon. It would be, if you were trying to retrieve your property, your enslaved people, you dare not go into that place without an army. Don't try to form up a simple posse and go up in those places trying to retrieve those people. And if you were to look at some of the places right in South Carolina where I live, you look at some of those black communities, some of those communities started out as maroon communities. In other words, kind of far off in places where one could barely survive. These people went into these places, swamps, the dismal swamp, and they made a living. They made a life for themselves in these places.
Awesome, thank you. So I think like recently, I think down in Virginia, someone just discovered possibly the remnants of a community at the Great Dismal Swamps in South Carolina. And so African Americans are resisting enslavement in many different ways through self-liberation, through creating through communities that might be in maroon areas.
Oh yeah, yeah. We were doing it, and it's that agency. And what the Slave Dwelling Project brings attention to was the fact that we had to acquiesce. In fact, had our enslaved ancestors not acquiesced, you and I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now doing what we're doing. But beyond those who acquiesced, there were those also who were seeking their freedom, running away, and when the opportunity for some came to join the military during the Civil War, some did. We didn't just sit idly by waiting to be freed. We took action in obtaining that freedom, and as you stated also, some went through the court system to try to obtain that freedom.
Yeah, excuse me. The court system, I think, is a fascinating example of African Americans using agency, because oftentimes many of them could not read or write. It wasn't like you could easily find your local lawyer and say, "Hey, can you help me get my freedom?" Because the system was slavery was a well-developed system definitely by the 19th century, when most people were suing for their freedom. What are some of the more complex conversations that you've had when you come to sites like this?
Yeah. So what we're doing now, sleeping is easy. Anybody can do that. But as people request to join me, to have these sleepovers, I make them aware now that before we go to sleep, we have to have a conversation. And it's usually a conversation around a campfire. And the conversations are about, those things, legacy, the legacy of slavery, slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. One of some of the more interesting conversations, one of the more recent ones, one young lady revealed that her father was a member of the KKK. Now, at the time that she told us that, he was suffering from Parkinson's disease. His time on earth at that point was very limited. I don't even know if he's still with us on this earth. One young lady in another conversation talked about Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof was a gentleman who went into the church in Charleston, South Carolina, and took out 9 lives. Well, she said to us that her brother was mimicking those actions of Dylan Roof. Now, I have not heard anything from that general area about a similar incident, and I'm hoping that I don't. In these conversations, we get a lot of confessions of people, being descendants of slave owners. This project seems to attract those type people who are descendants of slave owners, and they're not running from it. Some people discover that they're descendants of slave owners, and they want to sweep it under the rug. They want to keep quiet. I don't know how many people are familiar with Ben Affleck and Professor Gates and his show on PBS when Ben Affleck discovered that he was descendants of slave owners. He wanted that part of the program pulled out of there, and I think they yielded to him. But more and more people these days are making that confession, and they're owning up to the fact that they're descendants of slave owners. They're not running from it. There was one conversation that I had at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and if anybody's familiar with the Sally Hemings story, I stayed there with the descendants of Sally Hemings. And an element of that, those descendants want to think that the Thomas Jefferson Sally Hemings relationship was consensual. Well, there's another element of that family that thinks the opposite, and that conversation got so contentious that I had to physically step in to keep those people from coming to blows. Another conversation that I had at the Beauregard Kai's house in New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, there was this one gentleman, senior white gentleman, when we were talking about free labor, well, he made the statement that it wasn't free labor because the enslaver had expenses. He was clothing them, he was housing them. And not that he was wrong, He was just wrong at that time for that situation that we were having that, around that campfire, and that got a little contentious also. So we have great conversations now. Because we're in the period that we're in now, we've got to follow the science, and in COVID has taken its effect, and it's kind of running things now, it's in charge. We still have the conversations, but it's similar to what we're doing right now. It's you and I, we're social distancing, doing what's necessary to still have this conversation. We're broadcasting to the public. We're hoping that we're going to get some input from them. There was a situation where just recently we had a conversation through Zoom, and we were talking about, of course, the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's life. And we had a participant from New York, African-American female, and she talked about, her fear of her son. Every time her son is out of her presence, she's worried, because, of course, he's a young black man. And all the fears, all the threats to him just by being a young black man. So we talk about these things. We talk about weddings on plantations. So we have some great conversations.
So that idea of that black mother today being afraid, and with her son or daughter being out and not at home. Do you feel that that's something that is a generational thing that's been passed on since? Is that a legacy of enslavement and Jim Crow?
Yeah. If you look at the reason a lot of police forces were formed, it was for the purpose of ensuring that there were those patrols, paddy rollers, to ensure that any enslaved person that's not on a plantation it has a pass. And folks had those assignments to do that, and that's the origin of some of these police forces that are out there. And because that is the case, a lot of that was started there historically has been passed on through these generations, through these centuries, and we're still dealing with the residuals of a lot of that. And so to connect all that, we got to understand those things that we place slavery, like convict labor. That's certainly a residual of that connection from the law and the way we enforce laws then. Even after slavery, we're going into convict labor, and now this convict labor is kind of manifesting itself in some of this police brutality that we're dealing with. So we have to connect those dots.
Interesting. We actually have a question coming in from the audience.
So we have a question from Omar. What do you think about when descendants of slaveholders say that their ancestors were good to their slaves?
Well, yeah, I get that a lot. I'm also an employee at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, South Carolina, and because I'm an employee at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, I get that question often. Our folks inquire about that a lot, and part of the problem is that history that we've been disseminated, that history that we got, that revisionist history that's been disseminated to people. It gives an impression that the enslavers were benevolent. It gives the impression that the enslaved were happy. That's not the case. The way I deal with it at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens is I hit them with the facts. They advertised for 3 runaways. The last enslaver was an Episcopal priest. They freed no one. They extracted from the land all that they could to live the lavish lives that they did, and they did it at the expense of stolen labor. I further tell them that anyone who can convince themselves that it's okay to enslave a person are morally corrupt. So, if those people did not, like the Grimke sisters, also an element of the Drayton family, they rejected the opportunity to enslave people, and they became abolitionists. So despite the fact that there were enslavers of that period, there were also abolitionists. Now, we can't give all the abolitionists all the credit that we tend to give them, because a lot of abolitionists were for freedom, but they weren't for equal rights. In other words, you could be free, but you get on this boat and going back to Africa and do your thing over there. So there's that.
Actually, I'm going to give you some water real quick on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, Maryland, early on when Maryland decided when slavery became less profitable, especially the tobacco crops in Maryland became less profitable, Maryland had a colonization organization to have enslaved people go back to Africa, even though Maryland continuously had practiced slavery. And Prince George's County was one of the largest, held one of the largest populations of enslaved individuals in the state. So yeah, just because you were an abolitionist did not mean you were open for equality. And speaking of that, oftentimes we hear like Quakers being kind of being abolitionists and leading those abolitionist causes, and the Snowdens were a Quaker family, yet they owned and enslaved vast numbers of people of African ancestry. Is that something you come across very much in your studies?
Yeah, William Penn, say the founder of Pennsylvania, slave owner, Quaker. You also got the situation. First Lady Dolly Madison came from a Quaker family, a slave-holding Quaker family. So we must understand, before the Quakers were abolitionists, they were slave owners. And, and most of them transitioned into being abolitionists, but some didn't. Some continued to enslave people until their death, the death of the enslavers. So yeah, that tends to kind of rub people the wrong way also when you hit them with that fact. But yeah, I come across a lot of situations where we praise the Quakers, and they're deserving of the praise that they get. But we need to add everything to that story, that before they were abolitionists, they were slave owners.
So recently, the movie Harriet came out, about Harriet Tubman, who was a native of our fair state of Maryland. And in that film, they discuss quite a number of roles that African Americans played in the 19th century. You had Harriet Tubman, who obviously actively resisted enslavement. You had her husband, who stayed, and then obviously remarried. And then there was a portrayal of two gentlemen who were black slave catchers. Have you ever come across any history of that, or
slave catchers? No. However, I have come across situations of black overseers. In fact, Magnolia Plantation, where I work right now, the last overseer was an enslaved person. But as far as patrollers, enslaved catchers, I have not come across any of those.
And what are some reasons that that a person may have been placed as a role as an overseer or a driver who was another enslaved person or an African American is in charge?
Well, there's a lot that factors into that. I'm sure that enslaver they had a long tradition of enslaving people, and I'm sure they had gone through many white overseers up until the point they made the last overseer there one of their enslaved person. I have to assume that because of the work or lack thereof that they had gotten out of those white overseers, that they had this last overseer be a black man. Another thing that you have to consider is this: those overseers are in a tough position. That's a tough job, because you got to get the work out of those enslaved people. and you also have to answer to the enslavers. Now, in getting the work out of these enslaved people, you know, you got to administer that public punishment. You know, punishing an enslaved person in isolation does very little for the system. You got to make it public. But you're also in a position where you can't. It's not your intention to maim. Certainly not your intention to kill, because again, this is property. This is this enslaver's tool. If you take it out of commission, then you're messing with his bottom line, his income. So you know you gotta find that person can straddle that line.
Okay. There's another question coming in. Steph.
Okay, we had a question. How do you feel about the new announcement that Trump thinks that teaching Black history is divisive?
So yes, that was just announced, I think, a day or two ago, where I guess the New York Times was doing the 1619 Project, and President Trump recently announced that he wanted to start the 1776 Project. I'm assuming alluding to the Declaration of Independence. What are your feelings on that?
Well, that kind of makes, if indeed that takes hold, if it has any legs, then that makes the slave dwelling project obsolete. It makes what we're doing right now illegal, and what we're doing right now is we're adding the element, we're changing the narrative. We're adding an element of the story that should have been there all the time. And if indeed what Trump is proposing to do, that's supporting white supremacy, that's supporting a false narrative, that's supporting a revisionist history. And by the way, I think he calls this this newly formed commission the Patriot Commission, if I got the words correctly. Now, how could it be patriotic but still yet support Confederate monuments? Isn't the Confederacy all about taking away all this patriotism, or this country of patriots? Weren't they like against all that? So how could those two exist together? But I think that the fact that you know, the 1619 Project has come to fruition, the fact that we are now capable of telling our own stories, we get a lot of pushback. You know, there was a point in our history where we were muted. You know, it was illegal for our ancestors to be educated. But now that we are educated, now that we have our own scholars among us, and we're now telling our own stories and telling the truth about the history of these United States, there's pushback. There's pushback because all those things that should have been there before, folks are now resisting it. They're thinking that equality means minimizing them, and it's not that. It's just that it's not that we're trying to be above and beyond folks who don't look like us. We're just trying to be equal too.
So some news just happened, and I do want to take a moment to pause, because a great American and a historic American was just announced that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg just passed away. And obviously she made history by just the historic nature of her being placed in the Supreme Court, and even with this legacy of that we're talking about today, of fighting the legacy of enslavement. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a champion of civil rights, that fight for civil rights that was started in what become these United States in 1619, when the first enslaved Africans were brought to this country, when the first women from Europe were brought to this country. So we would definitely like to offer our condolences to